Nothing, the smartphone manufacturer, has brought out its very first over-the-ear headphones. They're appropriately named the Headphone 1, and they were announced at the very same time as the rather radical-looking Phone 3. If you want a review of the phone itself, make sure you check it down in the description below. Now, these headphones were made in partnership with KEF, and as someone who's reviewed over 800 audio-related devices, that actually piqued my interest, because KEF makes some really expensive and pretty good-sounding loudspeakers. So how's that technology translated into headphones? Well, you'll be finding out very soon. Now, before jumping into the really detailed review, I would just like to mention that these headphones are, ironically, the most expensive in the UK. I say that because Nothing is supposedly a London-based company. They can be found for £300 in the UK, €300 across Europe, and surprisingly $300 in the US. So therefore, they're cheapest over the pond. Nonetheless, in this review, you're going to see if they're actually worth their price tag, how they compare to some of their competitors, and if you should actually go out there and buy them. So to kick things off, let's talk about connectivity, and here it's great to see that you've got quite a lot of different options. First off, you have got the auxiliary 3.5mm jack input, handy for example for a turntable, a DAC, or more appropriately connecting up to the in-flight audio system of a long-haul flight. Then you've also got the digital USB Type-C input. This was working over my Windows desktop computer, and I was able to output 24-bit 96, therefore getting the high-res audio badge. Better still, I was also able to utilize the physical controls that were found on the headphones, for example, to adjust the volume of my output. So that's quite handy because it gave me a little bit of a kind of shortcut. Then also, I was able to use these headphones directly when connecting over to my daily driver. In other words, my Poco F7 Ultra smartphone. This is an Android device, and via its USB Type-C port, I was able to output audio directly to it, yet again giving good sort of capabilities. Now, of course, these have got wireless support. In other words, they've got Bluetooth version 5.3, with the SBC, AAC, and the LDAC codec supported. The latter is certainly appreciated because it gives you the utmost audio fidelity and therefore reduces this transmission loss, and therefore doesn't sound as compressed as such as the SBC or AAC codecs will do. Android users will certainly rejoice because LDAC is pretty much supported globally on every single Android device. However, if you're on iOS, in other words an iPhone, then you'll be limited to the AAC codec anyway, so therefore these headphones have got that support. The SBC codec, in my opinion, is provided for those more legacy devices that might not have, for example, AAC or indeed LDAC support altogether. But you definitely will want to use that sparingly because it definitely gives you the most sort of transmission loss and sounds a little bit more compressed. Now, I would also like to highlight that these headphones have got Bluetooth multipoint. For those people who are not aware, this is a feature which effectively allows you to connect up simultaneously to a few different devices. In the case of the Nothing Headphone 1, that's 2 devices. That's good because you can connect up, for example, to a laptop and simultaneously to your smartphone. So when you get a call on your smartphone, you can seamlessly switch to your smartphone without having to disconnect and reconnect. Now, better still, Bluetooth multipoint also operates on the highest quality LDAC codec, so therefore means that you don't have to degrade the audio performance for that sort of extra bit of versatility. Now, while that's all very well and good, what about when it comes to the all-important sound quality? Now, I would like to highlight that you have got an 8-band parametric EQ. For those people who are not aware what that means, it effectively is the fact that you can adjust even more settings with the 8-band EQ, so it's not exactly fixed. However, I did find that the overall audio volume of the headphones themselves, in other words, kind of the overall gain, was massively reduced if I was, for example, adjusting the EQ. Here's a little sample. Now, hopefully there you were able to pick out that the headphone volume was actually changing with the EQ profile that I was choosing. This is the very first that I've ever come across on any sort of audio related device that I've actually reviewed. Potentially it's a little bit of a bug that Nothing can address, but as far as I'm aware, no other reviewer has actually picked this out, which does leave me head scratching to say the least. Nonetheless, all I can say over here is I went for the simplified approach purely because it didn't affect the overall audio volume all that much, because I only added 1 or 2 notches in terms of the treble EQ. Now elsewhere, via the Nothing app, I also disabled the spatial audio, which is actually supported, and also the head tracking feature. These two, in my opinion, are a little bit gimmicky. The spatial audio will give you kind of a 360 dimension type of sound, however, will affect the overall mid-range severely. So therefore, you just expect a little bit of a kind of fishbowling effect, with the benefit of the fact that it sounds a little bit more spacious. In terms of the head tracking feature, I don't really understand why anyone would actually utilize that, but if you tilt left or tilt right, then it'll kind of track it with your head, and therefore it will sound like the speakers are coming in front of you per se. So when you're turning away, then your left ear, for example, kind of cuts out. Again, not really sure why you'd ever need this sort of feature, but it's something that is present if you so wish to use it. I didn't actually utilize it myself because, as I said, I did find it a little bit gimmicky. Now, when it comes to the actual raw sound quality, these have got a frequency range from 20 Hz up to 40 kHz. And they've also got 40mm dynamic drivers, which have been apparently custom made with KEF and also Nothing. Now, in terms of my own subjective opinion, in terms of the overall audio performance, they actually were somewhat decent. However, not exactly all that impressive considering the overall price tag. Now, let me expand. Now, first off, in terms of the sub-bass tones, they're certainly there. If you were to enable the bass enhancement feature, for example at level 1 or level 2, you'll have a good sort of low-end pronounced bass. The sub-bass is certainly there and will certainly excite those sort of bass heads out there. Similarly, when it comes to the overall mid-bass slam, it's very much in your face. You might actually want to reduce the bass slam a little bit, but in my case, as someone who listens to EDM, D&B, and also R&B, I actually found myself pretty excited in terms of the overall sound that it was portraying, namely in the bass department. However, the overall sort of comments and praise couldn't be quite associated with the overall mid-range. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not shambolic. It's not really heavily recessed and pushed back, but it does have a V-shaped sound signature. When I was comparing and contrasting them to some of my favorites, for example, the likes of the Stax headphones, which are in partnership with Edifier, or for example, the Sennheiser Momentum 4 wireless headphones, these actually completely outperformed the Nothing Headphone 1. And this meant that the overall mid-range of the Headphone 1 just felt a little bit hollow. This is something that some people will potentially pick up on, and indeed if you're coming to some premium headphones for the very first time, you might think, well, this is kind of a norm. However, for those people who are a little bit more experienced or have a variety of different headphones at their disposal, you'll quickly come to notice that the sound kind of feels a little bit flattish. Now, yes, that sort of flat sort of signature is something that you might come to expect when it's being partnered up with a manufacturer that produces loudspeakers, aka KEF. However, when it comes to the headphone world, I feel this kind of flat sort of sound signature, which is not really in its true sense, does just feel a little bit odd. So therefore, I think some people will find themselves quite disappointed. Now, thankfully, the highs do extend pretty well at the top end, especially when you add a few notches in terms of the treble EQ, and it gives you that sort of toe-tapping, zingy feeling. No issues whatsoever when it came to the overall harshness or sibilance either, and therefore I had no problems when it came to the overall ear fatigue. Now finally we get onto its soundstage reproduction, and here was actually pretty impressive across the board. The instrument separation was certainly there, so therefore when it came to more challenging tracks, the headphones were able to keep up. In terms of the overall imaging, it was pretty good as well, and in terms of the overall reverb, well, it didn't seem too artificial. However, when it came to the overall width and depth, it did seem to have a little bit more of that closed-off sound. In other words, it doesn't sound as airy as some of its competitors. Not necessarily a bad thing, but for those people who want a little bit more of a spacious sound, and yes, without enabling the likes of spatial audio, then you might want to look at some of its competitors instead. Now next up we get on to call quality, and everything you can hear right now is coming directly from the headphones themselves. It's worth pointing out that you've got 4 microphones that are dedicated for calls, and you've got something called clear voice technology. I've actually heard that before, and shout out to Technics. Now for me to demonstrate as to how they perform in a noisy environment, I'll be facing my bookshelf speakers and playing back a track. It's from EAH-A800 and it's titled Like Me. The music right now is playing, and if I were to go quiet,
That should hopefully give you a little kind of demonstration of how they perform in a noisy environment. What I've found that in my test, it actually does a pretty good job of blocking out exterior noise and focusing on my voice only. However, it's worth mentioning that in terms of the raw call quality, it's not as impressive as some of its competitors. For example, the Sennheiser Momentum for wireless, which I've got on my head right now, and yes, everything you can hear right now is coming directly from the headphones. Hopefully you'll agree with me that in terms of the overall call quality, the Sennheisers just sound a lot better. However, in comparison to the Nothing headphones, they very much do struggle when it comes to a noisy environment, where you can hear a lot more of your surroundings. For example, if I go quiet, it's a lot easier to hear Priya J's vocals from the Sennheisers in comparison to the Nothing headphones. And in my opinion, in that respect, I'd much prefer using the Nothing headphones when it comes to calls, because I want the recipient to be actually hearing my voice rather than everything around in a better detail. Now, further emphasizing my point in terms of the overall versatility of the Nothing Headphone 1, everything you can hear right now is coming directly from the headphones, which are connected over a USB Type-C to Type-A cable to my desktop computer, which is using NVIDIA Shadowplay for the recording. So yes, you could output audio directly to the headphones, and you can also use them for in-game calls, or for example, just calls if you're doing them, for example, on Microsoft Teams.
Now, aside from the microphones being used for calls, you've also got dedicated mics for ANC. And yes, these have got active noise cancellation, where you've got 3 mics on each cup. Now, you have also got the ability of enabling and disabling active noise cancellation in terms of the levels that it has, and you've also got a transparency mode, which allows you to hear your surroundings. Handy, for example, if you're crossing the street. Now, it is worth pointing out over here that with ANC enabled, it will affect the overall sound quality of the headphones. And yes, in case you're wondering, my sound quality assessments I made at the beginning of this video were actually done with active noise cancellation enabled, because I feel that that's how a lot of people will be actually utilizing them. Here, ANC does affect the overall mid-range, whereby it does push them back a little bit further, and you've also got a little bit of accentuated low-end tones. This is something that you'd come to expect in cheaper headphones, although it's disappointing to see this sort of effect having a negative impact in terms of the sound quality at this price point with the Headphone 1. Now, in terms of the overall ANC capabilities themselves, well, they're decent. Nothing to really shout about. When comparing and contrasting them with my current daily headphone drivers when I'm out on the move, the likes of the Sennheiser Momentum for wireless, I found that they're pretty much on par. The Sennheiser, however, are not exactly a benchmark when it comes to active noise cancellation, and are completely trumped by the likes of what Sony and Bose can offer. Indeed, if active noise cancellation is your utmost priority, and you really want to be isolated from the world around you, then you might want to look at its competitors instead. It's not to say that ANC is terrible on these headphones, it's just not exactly its forte. Indeed, it will provide you decent isolation, but not exactly class-leading. So next up we get onto the Nothing X app, and through the main interface you can see the overall charge level of the headphones. Then you've got the noise cancellation options, where you've got low, medium, high and adaptive, and also the transparency and off mode. Spatial audio as off, fixed and head tracking. Bass enhancement, where you've got 5 levels to choose from. Level 1 is the one that I chose. And then also you've got the equalizer. And the simplified mode, I have gone for custom and +1 on terms of treble. However, you've also got the advanced mode, as I did mention before, with a parametric EQ, with an 8-band EQ to choose from. So for example, over here, you can adjust the frequency as to where it is, and also the overall width of how much is being affected. So good sort of customization, but as I mentioned before, it does affect the overall audio volume of the headphones. In terms of the controls themselves, they can be customized to a certain degree. So for example, the single press on the button, the press and hold. Then you've also got the roller. For example, over here, it's not customizable, whereas the noise control is, or indeed you can have no action. Then you've also got the volume control, which also is not customizable. And as for the paddle itself, it is also not customizable. But it's good to see that you've got a few different options for you to customize the headphones. In terms of the device settings, you can enable or disable low lag mode. As I mentioned before, I had no problems. You will definitely want to go on the high quality audio LDAC codec and make sure that's enabled. You've got over-ear detection, which is not something that I utilize, but it's good to see it included. And then you've also got the dual connection mode, which in other words enables Bluetooth multipoint. Then you've also got the ability of finding the headphones. Of course, you have got the ability of checking for firmware updates directly via the app as well. Moving on from the app, let's talk about its design. And yes, it's certainly different with its transparent look. It gives it a kind of edgy feel to it, and that, in my opinion, is actually pretty nice. But it's also pretty functional, because you've got physical buttons, which seem to be a bit of a rarity these days, therefore making it a lot more practical to use, specifically if you've got gloves on. Here you have got a physical on and off switch, so therefore you know when they're actually on or indeed off. You've got a roller wheel that can be pressed as well, a button that can be initiated, for example, for your smart assistant, and in fact with a Nothing phone you can also use it for your essential space recording. Then you've also got a paddle for song skips, or if you hold it, it can be used for scrobbling. So yes, indeed, I do think it's actually pretty practical. Furthermore, you've got IP52 rating, therefore giving it some dust and water resistance. Now, due to their overall design and their aluminium casing, these headphones weigh in at 329 grams. Not exactly the heaviest out there in the world, but nor the lightest. And therefore meant that while using them for shorter periods of time I had no issues. However, while using them for a longer period of time, I felt that the top of the headband was starting to dig into the top of my head, leading to a little bit of discomfort. This is also due to the fact that the top of the headband has only got a slight bit of padding. Speaking of which, over here, the ear pads themselves are pretty cushiony and soft. No issues whatsoever when it came to using them with reading glasses or, for example, sunglasses. However, while using them again for a prolonged amount of time, I felt that the clamp force was a little bit severe. Not to an extreme, however, I did feel that while comparing and contrasting them with some of its key competitors, for example the likes of Sony, Bose and Sennheiser, these headphones were just a lot more comfortable, at least with my head shape and size. Now, I would like to point out over here that the audio drivers can be swiveled, and therefore the headphones have got a flat design, making them handy to be placed within the hardshell carrying case which is provided within the box. And yes, I certainly do like its inclusion. However, it's a shame over here that the drivers cannot be folded inwards and therefore don't give them that sort of ultra compact feel like some of its competitors offer. On that note, I would like to point out that the ear pads can actually be removed. Upon first impressions, it didn't seem like they could be removed because the manufacturer had not communicated anything about them. And more often than not, that means that effectively you can't replace them. But thankfully, that's not the case. Now, to remove them, they actually take quite a bit of force, but I found that going from the top, you kind of had to prise them off, and yes, they do make quite a bit of sound. They've got a little plastic sort of ring that goes around them, and therefore means that yes, you could potentially replace it in the future, for example, if you do not like the pads themselves, or of course, if they just get worn out. Now, it's disappointing to see they're actually quite hard to remove because in comparison to some of their competitors, or for example, some wired alternatives where it's very easy to remove the pads, it would have been great to see that the manufacturer actually communicating this a little bit better. Now, what the manufacturer does provide, however, is some detailed information about its battery. Here you've got a 10,040 milliamp battery pack, which provides you roughly 30 to 35 hours with active noise cancellation enabled, or 54 to 80 hours with it disabled. In case you're wondering why there's a variance between the battery claims, that is because it's comparing AAC versus the LDAC codec, where the latter consumes a little bit more power. Nonetheless, over here, in terms of my own tests, I found that they were pretty much on par with what the manufacturer was claiming. Furthermore, a 5-minute charge will give you roughly 5 hours with ANC disabled or 2.5 hours with ANC enabled. Very handy if you want to quickly plug them in and therefore go out for your commute. It'll take you roughly 2 hours to charge from 0 to 100%. Now, I would also like to point out over here that I was able to simultaneously use them while charging them. One, I had Bluetooth enabled and then plugged them into a power source, it would briefly pause the music, and then I would have to manually unpause it. Then, of course, if I was plugged in via USB Type-C, it was automatically charging them anyway, at least from what I could tell. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict of the Nothing Headphone 1. And at their first stab at the over-the-ear market, I do think that they should be proud at what they've actually achieved. You've got a good set of features: spatial audio, head tracking, Bluetooth connectivity with good sort of codec support, wired capabilities over 3.5mm jack and also USB Type-C. You then also have got active noise cancellation with a transparency mode, a pretty comprehensive app with equalizer functionality, and also good sort of call quality. And of course the sound quality isn't too bad either, and its radical design makes it stand out over rival alternatives. The problem, however, in my opinion, is its overall price. At £300 in the UK or $300, I think there are some other alternatives out there. For example, with the likes of Cambridge Audio, Sennheiser, Edifier Stax, Sony, and of course Bose. some of which I've reviewed and will be down in the description below. Here I do feel that if these headphones were £50 to £100/$100 cheaper, then the conversation might have been a little bit different. But I'll be curious to hear your thoughts of these headphones down in the comment section below, and if you'd pick it over some of the rivals that I've mentioned. Now, if you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I hope you see you next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.